It is indeed good for me to be back here. It's kind of fun standing in the entrance as people are coming in and those who recognize me doing the double take kind of thing. You're here. It's like, so it feels like I've come home, which is great. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Father Jonathan McElhone, Franciscan, TOR. I was here served for 5 years, left back in 2017 to be reassigned to Franciscan University. And this past summer, I was reassigned again by my provincial. I'm now the vocations director for the community, which in business terms means I'm a recruiter. So please pray for me, because no one wants that job, okay? But, however, if you're a young gentleman, or even ladies, if you're trying to figure out how do you listen to God's voice and you want to talk about discernment, religious vocations, I'm here for you to help you do that. And it actually fits in well with this Sunday, because the church has declared this Sunday Mission Sunday. Do you realize that by virtue of your baptism, you are called to mission? That by virtue of our baptism, we're not just called to be like Sunday Catholics or just convenient Catholics, but that we're called to mission, to be just like the words say over our doors, to go out and share the gospel of the Lord. And what does that mean for us? Well, for us to before we can even begin to answer that, I think we need to answer that last statement of the gospel. Give to God what belongs to God. So what is it that's due to God? Or what are we supposed to give to the Lord? What can you give? And I would claim that each of us, whether we're small or whether we're older, have lots that we can give to the Lord. Now, it's been said God has everything, right? So he doesn't really need anything. It's not like we got to figure out what we got to get him for a birthday gift. But there's one thing that God doesn't own, and that is your own heart. Because he gives us that freedom to do with our heart what we desire, what we want to do. And so, which is beautiful, because it allows us to begin to love one another in a very profound way. And Jesus demonstrates what it means to love unconditionally each time we look at a crucifix. But for us to begin to look at our own heart and say, well, what is important to us? Well, if you want to know what's important, start keeping a tally of what you're doing throughout the day. The things that you keep going back to, or stuff that you start thinking about constantly. These things we can begin to reveal to us what it is that our hearts are actually focused on. But my brothers and sisters, we're called to really give to God what is due to God. First and foremost, that is worship, to praise, honor, as a response to Oriel Psalm said, to give glory to the Lord, glory and honor. And we do that partly by coming to Mass. We do that partly in how the ways we treat one another. Are we living up to our name as Catholics? Someone once asked me, well, Father Jonathan, if you were arrested for your faith, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Would there be more evidence against you than for you as a Catholic? I'm not sure that I want to end up in that courtroom. And yet each of us are called to evaluate our lives in how we live and give glory and honor to God, what we do with what has been entrusted to us. World Mission Sunday. My hope, desire, prayer would be that everyone at some point in time could have an experience of a mission trip. The last 6 years while I was in Steubenville, I had the chance to go on a mission trip pretty much every year, and even a few trips before that. So I've made it to 5 different countries, I think, as well as some domestic mission trips to Los Angeles, which quite an experience, to say the least, when you're on Skid Row, loving on those who have nothing. And there's something that I've experienced on every mission trip, and it's very different than our culture around us here. And that is that those who have nothing are actually the people that are the happiest. Could be at a place and someone's living in a shack that probably doesn't look much better than a cardboard box. Could throw a baseball through it and not hit anything. And yet these people are very content and they're happy. And it kind of causes me to wonder, well, why are they happy? They don't have electricity. They don't have running water. They're not checking their social media. Maybe that's why they're not happy, okay? And one of the things I think really is because they've learned how to give their heart to God, to trust, to depend on God, and allowing Him to provide for them. And they're giving back to God what is due to God. It's pretty amazing to see the least. These people who I try to love, the team I'm with tries to love on, provide for them in small, simple ways. And they're profoundly grateful. It begs the question, are we grateful to God for the blessings that He gives to us? Or do we just presume that they are due to us and that we deserve them? And if we're grateful, then how do we share that gratefulness back to God? But getting back to World Mission Sunday, I think it also invites us to the question, it's well, what mission is God inviting you to participate in? It could be as simple as going to your neighbor next door who you know you've barely ever seen, or maybe they have a struggle, and just loving on them, treating them with dignity, visiting them if they're lonely. Maybe it's a mission of going to a nursing home or to a hospital and visiting with people. It's something very simple. Maybe it's calling up that family member that's estranged and you haven't talked to in a long time. See, I think one of the things that stops us from going on mission so often, brothers and sisters, is actually two things. One, we presume someone else should be doing it, not us. And the other piece is sometimes we think, well, they've hurt me and I'm not going to turn around and give them anything. You're kind of giving them the cold hand. That's it. But that's not what our faith calls us to. That if we're invited into mission, then we're invited to be able to forgive as Jesus has forgiven us, which was unconditionally on the cross. And that we're called to love and give of ourselves, our time, our talent, our treasure. And I know from my time here that people are incredibly generous in many ways. Like the Advent angel trees. I was always amazed that you couldn't keep anything on them because they were constantly being, partaken of. And people would show up with incredible gifts. And those are good. Absolutely good. That generosity is good. But my suspicion is that the Lord is inviting us as a community, each of us individually, myself included, into something even greater, to something much bigger. Are you willing to respond to that invitation? Are you even willing to ask that question of God? What mission are you inviting me to be a part of? My brothers and sisters, when you hear the response from the Lord in that, never, never be afraid of answering it. I know in my own life when the Lord said, hey, Jonathan, a year from now, you're going to be somewhere different. I was working as an electrician. I had no clue what that meant. Eventually, it meant that I changed countries, moving from Canada to the U.S. to study, still not knowing where God was going to lead me. And I can assure you, as I've said yes to Him each day, my life as a Franciscan, as a priest, is constantly filled with things that I would never have imagined in my entire life. This past summer, I was involved in some conferences and just witnessing the miracles, physical healings, praying with people, seeing hearts transformed, seeing lives completely transformed because of God's goodness. It's profoundly life-giving to me. And even to be able to celebrate Mass this day, to be able to receive our Lord in the Holy Eucharist, that same Eucharist which has given strength to thousands upon millions of missionaries throughout the history of the church, and given them the strength to be able to stand up for their faith even when they knew that it was going to lead to persecution. This past week we celebrated the Jesuit martyrs, John de Brebeuf, Isaac Jogues, and companions. And they've always held kind of a unique spot in my own heart because that was one of my home parishes growing up in Ontario. And they had settled in kind of upper Ontario, Georgian Bay area. And they ministered out of there. And while some of them were martyred in the U.S., others were martyred in Canada. And at one point in time, they had actually gotten freed after being captured, tortured. Some of them had lost fingers. They went back to France. And their desire was, no, we need to go back to this new world to share the good news of the gospel with these Native Americans. And they went back knowing that it inevitably meant they were probably going to be martyred for it. They didn't count the cost. Why? Because they realized what was due to God, and they were willing to respond to the invitation of God to be on mission. And in the midst of doing so, they gave profound glory to God and strengthened the people of God. In fact, St. Kateri Tekakwitha was baptized, born in a town that one of the martyrs was martyred in. And we never know how the Lord's going to multiply the fruits, our yes to him. And I know that there's people in this place right now that the Lord's inviting you to consider a religious vocation towards a priesthood or a religious life. And to you specifically, I would say, do not be afraid. Echo those words of St. John Paul II. Do not be afraid to say yes to God. You might not understand where that's going to lead. Don't worry about it. As you put your trust in the Lord, as each of us put our trust in the Lord, he will work beautifully, powerfully through us, and we'll be able to return to God what ultimately is due to God. This day, as we continue with our celebration, we prepare our hearts to receive the Holy Eucharist. I invite you, ask for that grace, the grace to be able to say yes to God. Or maybe it's just the grace at this point in time to hear the voice of God, responding to you, what mission he has in store for you. As you open your hearts to that grace, know that the Lord will do powerful, beautiful, even miraculous things in your life, leading all of us, his church, our community, this entire world, closer to our ultimate goal, which really is heaven.